All right, so recently, as my fall gig schedule started to wind down and I had a little more time to practice for myself and not for gigs, I decided to work some more on my sight reading, which always needs more help. And I was reading through some choral octavos and I was thinking about a piece of advice that I would always give to people um, is, and I used to have more time to do this. If you can, take anything that's technically difficult for music you're working on and turn that into an exercise. Classical pianists in particular have this habit of they only work on things like scales and arpeggios in every key, but there's a ton more to your technique than that. For wind instruments, actually scales and arpeggios get you about 90% of the way there. If you can play all of your scales and arpeggios, you've covered almost everything technical that you're going to run into in music. But on piano, there's just between two hands, there's just too much going on. So, if you have trouble with like a left hand pattern where you need to cross over like that, and you're having trouble with this whenever it shows up in music, well, now just turn that into a pattern in every key. And, go around the circle fifths or something where you could incorporate it into, as you got a little tighter with it, you could incorporate it into like a chord progression. And now that is a pattern that you can use in your left hand. When it comes up in music that you are reading through, you will be more technically able to execute it. If you want to comp with that pattern just from chords, if you want to improvise, you now have that sort of under your fingers, and that's really useful. So what I started doing as I was sight reading through some of these choral octavos, and I realized that there were a couple of spots that were giving me some trouble. This is always the issue. And what happens with sight reading is you're going to have one of two bottlenecks. You're either going to get hung up technically, or you're going to get hung up because of a decoding, real-time decoding issue. So that basically means, a lot of, especially classical musicians who spend a lot of time memorizing, might have really good technical chops, but they cannot decode the music in real time. They don't read and drink in the notes fast enough. They haven't practiced reading ahead. Maybe they don't have the theory to chunk ideas together so that they can read faster. So they could play it, but they can't read it very quickly. And then on the other side, you can be very good at the reading, but you just don't have the technical facility to execute what you're reading. Now, this is a thing that has gone back and forth for me over the years. And I think early on, I always had my technical facility was well beyond my reading, but I've spent so much more time reading that most of the time these days, it's some small technical hurdle that I run into. And especially like in these choral octavos, it really helps highlight that. And it's one of the reasons that I tell people to read a wide variety of music because, once again, classical musicians in particular can run into problems when they suddenly need to read choral accompaniments or they need to read songs that are in pop styles because of the syncopations. And like that's just and there are a lot of style things that happen in more contemporary music that they're just not familiar with or they just never see on the page. Most of the things I'm looking at today are pretty straightforward, but there are some things that will be coming up in the future that I'm currently practicing on to record a later video that are definitely on. They are the kinds of things that would really hang up most classical musicians because you just never run into these kinds of dense rhythms in classical music. So the thing that I did to facilitate my personal practice of some of these technical hangups I was running into in these choral octavos is I just transcribed them out into Finale for myself to make just a little quick practice sheet so that I could go back to it. It was more like a bookmark for myself of, these are some spots that gave me a little bit of trouble. I should just kind of work through these in the background. These haven't really been at the forefront of my practice. And then as I was adding more licks and updating them over on my Patreon, my OG patron Nico actually made a really good suggestion. he wanted to hear me play them for pedaling, which makes sense. But then it made me realize, oh, like it's actually deeper than that. And I'm kind of an idiot for not thinking about it. A big thing with playing in any style, really, but maybe particularly pop and contemporary styles, is hearing so that you can play stylistically appropriately, articulations and things like that. It's not just the pedaling, it's articulation, it's all kinds of things. There's lots of accents that are sort of just implicit that you kind of understand more and more as a musician. And I guess this is one of those things that I almost was taking for granted, which I always warn people about that. It's a thing. Teachers get very out of touch with certain concepts, and the more experience I get, the more I'm noticing I sort of have that curse of knowledge where I take something for granted. So I'm going to go through some of these licks. Part of the problem is that, like I said, these were kind of back burner things that I was working on as far as my personal practice. I've been working a lot more on organ and some other things that have been getting a lot more attention. So these weren't quite ready to just like go. But I decided to sort of figure out a schedule so that I could actually work on these and prioritize them to get them recorded for the Patreon. And I actually think it could turn into an interesting project going through these. But I wanted to be able to demonstrate them, cleanly and think through them in ways that you can use them, because there's more than just how I have them transcribed on the page that you can actually do with these ideas. They're very flexible. But I will start with just the first tune that I had transcribed some things from, and I'll probably I'll just keep working through more and more of these, probably week by week, and I'll probably be adding new licks to the new patterns to the document, to the PDF, probably at a faster pace than I'm actually making videos about them. All right, so let's get started. Here is our first lick. So the thing that was personally giving me the most trouble with this was actually this little, I wasn't giving myself enough fingers to make it down to the low B flat. And then I had trouble jumping up this shape for this, what is essentially a C7 chord. It was just not comfortable in my hand as is. And I need to have the whole octave version of it, which that'll come back. That is a problem for me. But I wasn't comfortable with that. That's kind of the difficult thing for me, but especially coming from the B flat chord to jumping up there. So that's just what was hard for me. Okay, so this is kind of a fun and rhythmic lick, I guess. You got this interplay between kind of a 6/8 feel and a 3/4 feel, whether your accent is more of a 2 to the bar, 3 to the bar thing. Right. That's kind of interesting. I don't love the harmony. This is just a personal preference thing. I don't know if it's of a time or of a place. It's almost like a negative nostalgia. There's got to be like a German word for that, I assume. Germans seem to have good compound words for things like that. But negative nostalgia, it just doesn't feel good to me, this harmony here. So you've basically got 1 to a minor 5/7. Now, I personally don't think of it that way, because the way that I hear it is more of a variation of this, where you have 1 to the flat major 7. I'm sure you've heard that kind of thing. Tequila's basically that's the comping, like the entire, right? So that kind of thing, except that you're going to the 5 in the bass, but the right hand's doing the same thing. And I just don't like it. But personal preference doesn't really matter. Now, while I have some trouble with some of these things up here, with the little chord changes, you can simplify this a lot. I'm going to keep working on it to get that technically under my fingers. But as just a pure comping pattern, not a technical exercise, you can take out a lot of the eighth notes, and you can take out a lot of the motion moving your hand around between inversions, and you can keep the same feels. So something like, I'll write notes here. Something like that. And that reminds me, I need to write the chords in, and I probably will put the chords in on this sheet before I even, upload this. I'll edit that. As it is now, my version of it was just kind of, these were just kind of tossed up for me kind of in passing. But I'm finding it's making it a little hard to talk about this when I don't have the chords in front of me. And actually, those would probably be helpful for everyone. So the other thing is, you don't need to use these chords. You can play this over a different chord progression. So like, sort of my go-to demonstration progression is 1 6 4 5. So or you can make it more interesting, do some other things. Something like that. There's a lot of things that you can play around with, but you're still getting that same feel. You can take the feel of this and not really have to worry too much about the notes. But for me, for a technical exercise, I would play this till I have the notes a little better, and then I would start transcribing it into other keys. Transposing into other keys. So, like I said, I wish I had the chords written in. It'd make it easier. From the jazz chord notation, you might figure out how you're going to think about the chord changes. I probably should just make a video in detail on how to do this, but like just for the first two chords, for example, you have your one chord, and then you're going to like I said, it's kind of a minor 5/7, but you can think of it different ways. I mean, if you want to think of it as the flat major 7 over 5, which is kind of how I would think of it. You can do that. So then you can just put it in any key. I'm looking at this, and so the F's on top. So I'm thinking about how that chord's voiced. The root of the chord is on the top. So if I want to play this in the key of C, and then my next chord is basically just this real smooth voice leading down to I'm thinking of it as the flat 7 chord over my 5, which is G. So right, and that's just the first two bars. And then if I wanted to do it in B flat, same idea. Flat. Ooh, I'm out of practice on this, changing through keys. But yeah, you just keep doing that around the circle of fifths. It's one of those things where you'll find that if you practice doing it, it's crazy hard at first, and then it gets really, really easy to do that transposition. You get better technical facility, you get comfortable in other keys, you get faster at spelling things. It's a super great practical way to practice this kind of stuff. Okay, so now we'll move on to the second lick. There's actually another lick in the document. Like I said, these were practice things for me. The lick in the document, just it's basically it's a variation of the last bar of the first one. That's just there for me as a technical exercise, and you might find it useful for technical exercise. So it's in the document, it'll be the third lick on the page, but this is the second lick we'll look at. Okay, so this is actually one where pedaling can get kind of interesting if you want to talk about that. So there are a couple of different ways that you could pedal this. Generally, and I didn't really talk about pedaling on the first one, but the idea basically is just to pedal harmonically. And that's what you could do here. But even between the first two bars, you could have some separation depending on what you want. Because I could pedal the entire first two bars under one pedal. We'll need to even that up. Right, and that's all under one pedal, and that basically means that this lowest D is just going to keep ringing. But at the same time, you could pedal at the beginning of the second bar, and you would remove that. And then you have a little more motion as you're coming back down to the D. It's a really subtle thing. it doesn't matter that much. The other way you could do this is you could really choppily pedal it, so you could really emphasize the bass. So that gives you a really, I'm also kind of accenting the bass notes as I'm playing through that, but I'm pedaling on every bass note, because your ear fills in the gaps on harmonic stuff. Once you're established, and that establishes it for you, you don't need to sustain all of that stuff for somebody to understand what's happening. Their ear is sort of mentally sustaining what's happening harmonically and giving context anyway. And now you can lay into the rhythm a little heavier. And that was with no pedal at all, and you absolutely could do it with no pedal. From a technical standpoint, it's probably useful to be able to do it with zero pedal. So yeah, that one's pretty straightforward. Well, I'm trying to think what was actually giving me any trouble. I think I was not thinking it was the second bar. Making this cross without looking. I think I was having trouble doing that without looking. It's a really subtle thing, but when you're working on your reading, or I would say an important thing for your reading is to be able to not have to look at your hands, because anytime you're looking at hands, it's slowing down that stream of the music that you're decoding in real time. And eventually that is going to hang you up. And I know people who sight read really, really well, who absolutely look, and I do too. I glance a little because it's, especially if I know that it's not an issue for me, where it's like, oh, I'm not going to lose notes because I'm looking. But that eventually catches people who aren't aware that they should keep working on it as much as possible. Eventually you'll be playing something that's fast enough and note dense enough that because you needed to glance down for a note, suddenly you lost some notes, and that's a problem. So I'm always working on that, and whenever I'm working on something technically, I try to wean myself off of needing to look, so that I have that technical facility, so that I don't feel like I need to look in the future when I'm working on when I'm reading anything. And it's also, if I'm improvising, I tend to just be looking at my hands because I'm not, whatever. Like maybe I need to look at a chord sheet, if I'm comping, but like it's not a lot of information. Looking at chord sheets, one change per bar or something is not dense like reading sheet music. But yeah, I think I needed to work out that turn without looking, because I was just having trouble finding where to get that F. So yeah. Okay, so let's look at this third lick. This was from a slower section in the original piece. Whoops. This is interesting because it's really all that you're doing is you're just moving between these inversions. This is why I actually think it's useful that I had put out a document at some point that had these kinds of exercises in every key. Those are so useful because you just run into that everywhere. It was in that first lick where you had in that second bar, right? You've got that. You're always doing that thing where you're jumping between inversions of a chord, because sometimes you're sitting on a chord, and especially if you're just comping and you don't have any sheet music, you're sitting on a chord and you need to add rhythmic interest. And a good easy way to do that without doing anything is just moving between these. I personally would prefer to give some arpeggios or something like that. Moving eighth notes are good, but sometimes you need that stately thing, and that's really useful to have. So that's basically what this is. It's an exercise doing that. Now the thing about this that's interesting with the pedal is that what you've basically got on the first bar, or on the first beat, is a suspension. It's basically a B flat sus chord that immediately resolves down. So if you're just laying on the pedal, it works, but it's a little muddy. You really want to let that suspended note, the E flat, go away. And luckily here, even though you're going to lose that depth of the bass, on beat 2, you still have the root of the chord again. So if you release the pedal there, it's fine. And then I would pedal all the way through the rest of the bar once it's fully B flat to keep it smooth. Right. But yeah, the thing here is, it took me an embarrassingly long time to recognize this when playing hymns, especially. But when you've got these patterns like this, or in B flat here, right? Beats 3 and 4 here are just this chord with all the notes incorporated. So the second inversion of the B flat chord and the third inversion. And it's all those notes. You just don't play the middle note. It's that same shape. So that it's helpful to realize that that's that same shape. So if you can do this, then it's just leaving out that note. And that can be nice. Doing that generally for a sparser texture when you're moving between those kinds of if you're doing that thing, because that's a lot more stately, but leaving out every other note is a lot more delicate, and you can give this kind of gliding up the keyboard thing. It sounds nice. Okay, so this next one is really difficult for me. This is where the biggest technical challenges were for me, so let's play through it and then we'll talk about it. Okay, so I have small hands, and these octave chords are just a nightmare for me. I have a ninth in my right hand. My left hand is a comfortable ninth. My left hand stretches better, probably because I spend so much time playing octaves and having to roll bigger chords. I can hit a 10th, but it's a very I'm up against the keyboard. I can't do it fast enough to use it for stride or anything like that, but if I have a lot of time to prep it, it's basically useless, so that's all that matters. It's not useful. But because of my hand size, these octave chords are just a nightmare for me. And this is actually just the worst. Just the different inversions are horrible. So like in bar 2, jumping between those shapes really fast is really hard. I think that the first chord is actually one of the hardest shapes for me. B flat, second inversion is probably the hardest one, but this A flat chord here, in second inversion, I don't know, my hand probably looks tense. It's a little tense. It has eased up because I've been practicing this one, as my normal practice goes, 5 minutes every other day type thing, not really leaning into it, giving my brain time to process all these things, not getting RSI. But it's gotten a lot better, and I think it'll continue to get better as I keep looking at it. But yeah, this is a nightmare for me, and I just cannot jump between a lot of these quickly. And then just like in the first one, it's the same chord, this sus7 chord. Now in the first lick, I only had to be able to rock it back and forth, but here you've actually got it, and then you need to jump the inversions, right? So that's just, it's just not good in my hands. So this one's been a little bit of a nightmare for me to work on, personally. So if your hand is not as large, you could take out the bottom note and not lose a lot. And there are a couple of different ways you could approach this. You could change the rhythm very slightly. So something like, so there I'm just dropping the C. So I'm essentially turning the first note into a dotted quarter note. Or you could just double the E flat so you keep the rhythm the same. I'm still having that jump there, but in all of these, I've basically taken out the lowest note in the octave triads to make it easier. It's a little less thick, but you don't lose that much. Now, I would recommend that you keep working on it as is. I'm going to keep working on it as is because for technical exercise. But like the thing is, if you just want this for comping and you like this ascending bass line that's so powerful and you want to be able to add this to your repertoire as a comping lick, yeah, it doesn't matter that much. And if it's, you just do whatever you want with it. So those are some variations you can do on it. You don't even have to have, mostly you're maintaining the contour without losing almost anything. Even for performance, if I was having too much trouble with this and I needed to get it ready for a deadline, yeah, I might take out that bottom note because if I wasn't confident that I could get the octaves. As long as you've got this top part, you don't really, most people's ears aren't going to hear that the bottom note's missing. But at the same time, you could even get away with simplifying it even more. Something like that. I changed some rhythms around so that I'm just keeping kind of straight quarters in the right hand. It's a little less exciting, but you don't lose that much. So there are a lot of things you can do with these. All right, so let's look at the last lick from this. Similarly, has the same kind of difficulties as that one. Something like that. So yeah, this is another one of those where for me, it's just the issue that it's the octave triads. Those are a problem for me in my right hand. And it's maybe compounded by the fact that there's that little thing. And the only comfortable way to do that is to hit that thumb, and then it's even worse in that second bar because that's quick. That's a tricky little thing to do. But you could simplify this the same way that you did the last one. You don't lose that much by just dropping that bottom note. And the thing is, I am changing which note there's on the bottom because I'm not going to. Instead, I'm repeating the F instead of going down to that C. And you probably wouldn't have even noticed, other than me fracking some notes there. You probably wouldn't notice that much, especially as an audience member. Like, as long as the rhythm is intact there, you lose almost nothing by slightly changing the notes. It's chord tones. It almost doesn't matter what you're doing. It all works. All those notes they're just parts of the chord. So it's just whatever you decide that you want to do. But like I said, this one is definitely more of like a technical exercise for me because these octave triads are tricky. And this is particularly tricky when I was sight reading this. It was a long time ago, so I don't remember exactly, but I'm almost certain that I tripped all over this because this one has been really challenging for me to practice getting close to the tempo that was marked in the original octavo. So, okay, so I think I'm going to cut it there as far as the licks. I will try to be a little consistent with these, I think. I actually, Nico's idea is really great, and I actually think that I'm going to be able to find a workflow that works really well for this to keep doing these consistently. The next set of licks are actually well under my fingers. That they weren't that, from the next octavo, they were not that tricky. But there are definitely some coming up that are pretty rough. There's a Latin one that they're pretty tricky. And over on my Patreon, like you can see the ones that are coming up that I'm going to be working on. But the thing is, I think I have a workflow that I'm thinking of using that I think will work really well. I'll probably be adding more licks from my personal sight reading to the document at a much faster pace than I'm actually putting out videos on these. So that'll be fun. And thanks a lot to Nico for mentioning that to me. I'm an idiot, and I didn't even think about it. It makes all the sense in the world to do that. So anyway, I'm a little tired. I'm going to cut it here, and hopefully everybody found it a little bit useful.